Welcome everybody. I'm not sure I'll ever get used to this. We've been doing it for a year, but welcome to the latest in Daylesford Discusses Zoom panel discussions. And this evening we are very privileged to have a wonderful panel covering all sorts of elements of biodiversity in today's world in the UK. So a big welcome. Daylesford Discusses to the Uninitiated is a series of regular events where we try and bring together a nice friendly forum for questions and knowledge to be shared. But this time round, we've got some four very diverse speakers from those that have worked in government, those that have been MEPs, big-time campaigners, big educators in biodiversity and the natural world, and academically trained as well. So we're very lucky this evening. We are going to talk this evening about biodiversity, which of course is a huge subject that is on the radar of many, mainly through sort of the likes of David Attenborough making it such a big issue. But ecological collapse is very important to be addressed for all the reasons hopefully we'll hear this evening. I'm sure you know many of them already. So on to the panel. I'll introduce the panel and then we'll get straight into the questions. We really do welcome questions, so please, if you'd like to pop them in the chat, that's probably the best way. And then we have the wonderful Caitlin in the background who's going to flag some questions for me to ask at the end. And then we'll see how that goes. Maybe we'll bring some people in at the end as well. So yes, without any more ado, I think I've remembered to address everything. I'm sorry we can't all be in one of our lovely stores this evening, but for the time being, this is good enough. So, Dr. Richard Benwell, so a background writing some pretty important policy for the government. So the Agriculture Bill, the Environment Bill, and the Fisheries Bill that we've all seen in the last year come to light. And now more latterly, Chief Executive of the Wildlife and Countryside Link, a wonderful organisation bringing together the views and missions of many different very important organisations in the world of biodiversity. Paul de Zylva, you and I went back, we just decided about 8 years when you founded the B Cause for Friends of the Earth, and we were involved in that from the early days. It was wonderful that Friends of the Earth took the initiative on such an important issue and got it raised right up the agenda and continued to this day, which is fantastic. Alison, Zoological Society London, we have not met, but it's a great privilege to bring you on this evening. We were just talking about your interest in the marine environment, or your background in the marine environment, and but importantly for us, the mouth of the River Thames. So we kind of look after the top end of the Thames on the even load catchment, where we have quite a lot of the riparian up at Daylesford of the even load. So we try and stop the phosphate and nitrate and all the damage that's being done up at the top of the river, and you're taking care at the other end of the intertidal, I suppose, and out into the marine environment. So I look forward to covering that. But and amongst other things, the Essex Native Oyster Restoration Initiative. Sounds fascinating. And Shaun Spiers, Executive Director of the Green Alliance, another very important organisation that's bringing together a number of organisations that represent the natural environment, but more besides the wider environment as well. So I was fascinated to see that from 94 to 99, you were an MEP for the South East, serving on the European Parliament's Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee. So a very important position there. And you have written a book as well, How to Build Houses and Save the Countryside. Well, we know there's an awful lot of house building going on at the moment, and maybe we'll touch on and how that relates to biodiversity at some stage this evening. So thank you very much. I will try and keep my waffle to a minimum and let the great panel do the talking. So without any more ado, what is biodiversity? Richard, kick us off. Would you mind? What is biodiversity? Does the term relate to habitats as well as plants and animals, do you think?
It's all the good things in life, Tim. It's the birds and the bees and the plants and the habitats, the whole caboodle. So I guess if we're being formal, biodiversity is the sort of everything from the genetic diversity out there in species populations and in plant populations, through to the range of species that inhabit the earth, and I guess we can include plants, animals, all of those things in our definition. So I'll leave it at that, as simple as that.
Brilliant, brilliant, nice and simple. Paul, we know what biodiversity is, but why does it matter?
Why does it matter? Why does biodiversity matter? Because of its diversity and because of its naturalness, if you like. And it matters because life wouldn't be life without it. Life would be very different if we lost the significant number of species that we could well lose if we carry on as we are. So if you look at biodiversity as the web of life, we're gnawing away at that web of life and expecting everything to still stay the same, and that's a bit foolish, really. I think a chap called Einstein kind of has well rehearsed that point. So it matters because it underpins our ability to function as a species. It underpins the habitats and the ecosystems that we rely on, and we very often, I suppose, take for granted, whether it's for everything from clean air. So we all know that trees help support us with clean air, but we're denuding forests, through to marine habitats, which soak up carbon or support species that we then expect healthy seas to produce things that we might feed from. And the connection between those species, there is a thing called the food chain, which relies on healthy soils or healthy ecosystems to support different layers of life. And you start to, I always equate it to a global game of Jenga. If you end up removing too many of the bits of the tower, then things will collapse. But I'm probably getting ahead of myself. But it matters because it helps support life on Earth. And that web of life can only be torn and frayed to a certain point before it becomes unviable. Very
interesting. Yes, Jenga. I have not heard that analogy, but it absolutely does stack up, so to speak. Sorry, that's a dreadful pun. How is biodiversity measured then, Alison? We've heard what it is and why it's important, but of course you can't really campaign for something or teach it or anything else unless you're measuring it. So as perhaps the one that's more into measuring biodiversity, how do you do it? What's your interpretation?
Well, I spend my life counting fish, but I think there are different ways of measuring biodiversity. Fundamentally, we're looking at the number of species or number of plants, animals, single cell organisms that live in one place. We're also looking at about how many of them are endemic to that region. So how many of them actually just live in the one area that we're looking at. But we're also looking at genetic diversity. So if you've got a pool of the same animals, how do they differ amongst a population? So all of these will give us an understanding of what the biodiversity is. But I guess the important thing within this discussion is what are the trends over time? So how are the diversity changing over time? How is the genetic pool faring if we're shrinking the number of animals there? Are we losing those endemic species that are so unique to the place that we're doing, that gives the character and the soul of the place that we live in? So looking at trends over time is how we do it. Easy when you've got like maybe one species in one field, but difficult when you're looking globally. At ZSL, we try and do that, and we produce a document called the Living Planet Index, and that very clever people beyond my brain matter bring together all the data from across the world and collectively look at trends over time. And we have a similar document in the UK called the State of Nature, which RSPB champion. And again, that looks at sort of trends over time in the UK and tells us a picture of what's happening with biodiversity.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Of course, it's an awful lot of statistics, and we've all become rather familiar with statistics over the last year. And actually, that sort of connection to why science is so important. It's based on statistics and analysis. So a very important part. Shaun, we've touched on it already, but in your opinion, is it fair to say we're facing a biodiversity crisis?
Yeah, I think it's undoubted that we are, really, and the statistics that Alison mentioned sort of show that. I think a quarter of animal and plant species threatened with extinction. We've a 70% decline since 1970. It's staring us in the face, and happily, governments are becoming, particularly the UK government, I should say, beginning to become aware of it. Everybody's familiar with the climate crisis, but the other side of the climate crisis is the biodiversity crisis, and you can't tackle one without tackling the other. Quite
exactly. So let's move on a little bit more locally to British biodiversity, because I think we've just discovered that there's organisms within the middle of massive ice caps in the Arctic, which is a whole nother mind-blowing sort of discovering life on Mars sort of experience for some scientists. But so let's try and bring it back to something which is a bit more tangible in Britain. Alison, how many different species are there in the UK, roughly speaking, and how many of those are native? Because of course, human history has meant that we've actually influenced a huge amount of our biodiversity, not just in the last 20, 30, 40 years, but over millennia. So tackle that question if you wouldn't mind.
I know. Well, I think that, well, everyone might correct me, but I think there's about 70,000 different species in the UK, of which are native. I think you're absolutely right. I think many of the species we think of native, like apples, perhaps they came 2,000 years ago with us. So maybe someone else can tell us how many are native. But
I think most of them are native, depending on how you decide what's native. I mean, there are lots of species which are now, they've been here so long, they've adapted and they're not really causing a problem. There's always these debates, aren't there? So the latest blame species to get the blame is the green parakeet. Is there evidence it's really causing harm? Probably not. You either like them or you don't. But there are other species which are more problematic. But a lot of species have arrived here and they've settled in perfectly fine, and they're performing a function, and they're not really causing a problem. So little owls, for example, are not a native species, but they're naturalized. So I think I'm right, Alison. You'll probably correct me, but I think the Natural History Museum are trying to do the genetic sequence for about 66,000 species, which will give us more data. But Britain's more varied in terms of its wildlife than perhaps people imagine. I don't think we can claim to be as a biodiversity hotspot in the same way as the tropics, for example, but there's a lot of treasure on our doorstep.
It's worth adding maybe that invasive species and non-native species are becoming established at a pretty high rate, and possibly an increasing rate. So I think we usually say about 10 non-native species are established in Britain each year, and that's things arriving in ballast water or in trees that we're importing to plant, or indeed moving of their own volition as climate change expands ranges. So the number and pressure from non-native species is on the up.
There's an interesting WhatsApp group that I'm involved with, which is the North Cotswold Beekeepers Association, and we got into a deep discussion about the native black bee, and this is an interesting one for some of you to answer possibly. There's a big movement to try and hold on to the black bee, and I'm a big believer in that. Try and keep the genes pure and so on. And we've actually been breeding in with all sorts of different populations around the world. But as we know, climate change is really upon us, and our climatic belts are shifting. Should we be looking to perhaps embrace some of that genetic diversity to enable us to adapt better? I throw that open to the floor.
Depends how you do it. it depends how you do it. We can interfere with nature and make an awful mess. And yeah, there are some species which are going to arrive here anyway. So there is kind of modelling of how that's likely to happen. But what Richard said, Alison talked, the diversity issue is really key, because you don't want to just say, oh, we'll give up on some species just because we found something new. We should be hanging on to as many of those species as possible. You talk about the native black British bee, wild bee, which used to be the most common kind of managed bee in the UK, but died out through disease, and then beekeeping rates tended to fall. But there is a movement to bring it back, particularly up in Lancashire. Some really interesting initiatives, but there's always a danger of focusing on one species and forgetting the rest. So if we're talking about diversity, then we have to welcome all comers, really, apart from the really nasty ones.
Yeah. I agree. I think the word resilience is going to come up quite a lot today. And I feel like if we get to the point where we've got healthy ecosystems, resilient ecosystems, we could probably manage to have a few non-natives arrive. It's when they become sort of the invasive and depleted, then we get into an issue. We've just worked out the rate of arrivals in the Thames. We get half a species a year. It's been at the moment, but not all of them are causing we've got some that are living very happily, but when you start getting sort of monospecific riverbanks with your Himalayan balsam, or when you start looking at other things, that's when it becomes
the signal crayfish in the water and the
exactly
above it.
But maybe because the bigger threat is that we built on all our shore banks rather than having crab that goes into it. So
yeah, interesting. How do you think British biodiversity has been affected over the last decade or so? Can I throw that one to Richard? Do you mind if tackle that question?
No, I don't mind at all. I mean, I have to say the story of the last decade has been a story of continuation of 20 decades worth of mounting pressure on the natural environment. And one of the challenges we face in trying to look after biodiversity is that most of the changes we're experiencing are long-term and gradual changes. So people often don't notice. We think a lot at the moment about the characteristics of our uplands. And when folk think about a national park, it's the semi-denuded landscape that they think of, because it's been like that all their lives. But it wasn't like that 100 years ago. It's been intensive management of our fields and farms, and heavy stocking in the uplands, and intensive agriculture. These things change the landscape slowly and gradually. And so, we might notice local changes. We might notice the development that pops up down the road and suddenly feel a great pain. But actually, it's the sort of multi-decade changes that are chipping away at our natural environments and slowly reducing the resilience of those ecosystems that matter. In the last decade, there have been some bright signs. We're maybe starting to realize that you can build nature into communities. You're starting to see swift bricks popping up in houses as people realize that, we're the end of the road for swifts. You're starting to see farmers planting for the turtle doves as they arrive each year. So mixed trends, but continuation of long-term decline has been the story of the last decade. So our great mission now is to make the next decade the decade of change. And the world is about to sign a great undertaking to try to finally halt the decline of biodiversity by 2030. And that's an amazing mission. And it is doable, but we've already set it twice before and failed. So it'd be really great to think about in the conversation ahead, what's going to make the difference this time, and why in 10 years' time, hopefully we can start to see things finally taking an uptick.
Interesting. And Shaun, Richard mentions other countries. How does the state of our biodiversity compare to other countries? Is that something you understand?
I understand it because I've read Richard's blogs and so on, and Richard assures me that we have the most depleted natural environment in Europe. So I think that's right. Richard's not nodding, but anyway, we we're not doing particularly well in this country. I do think, by the way, just in terms of the UK, in terms of the point that Richard makes about the uplands, we do, I think, have a job to do about in reimagining landscapes managed for biodiversity. One of my previous roles was with CPRE, and people do like the landscape of their childhood, and somebody who likes natural beauty can walk around one of these denuded national parks and think this is the most beautiful place in the world. An ecologist will walk around getting angry about the lack of biodiversity. I saw recently George Monbiot tweeted a picture of the Cambrian Mountains and said what a ghastly ecological desert it was. Actually, the picture was rather beautiful. So we do need to think about how we bring back life in a way that people also regard as enhancing the landscape and natural beauty as well as natural life.
It's interesting.
It's a really interesting point, because that kind of Richard talked about trends over time, and most of the trends aren't heading in the right direction. And then you're right, Shaun talks about what people appreciate now, but with the Bee Cause campaign, Tim, that you referred to earlier, we were having conversations with thousands of people who came to us on the back of that campaign, and people saying, "Oh, I saw a bee today." And we said, but the data shows if you saw one species of bee today, 50, 60 years ago, you would have seen 4. Yeah. So this kind of time lapse, if you like, is really key. And you can look at most types of habitats or conditions, on land, but in the sea as well, where we've managed to empty we've developed the banks, we've dredged the soil, the sands and the gravels, and we've emptied the seas for pretty rapacious levels of consumption without thinking through that. And so those are the kind of pressures. They're everyday pressures. And then if you can, I think the challenge, as Shaun said, how to reimagine the landscape and say what could be there if we brought things back and we did things more sensibly that ultimately we benefit from. And I think that's the game. And so people can then understand why a habitat might like. And I totally get it. I find many of our national parks to be stunning, but could they be even better for biodiversity as well? I think that's a valid point to make. I know though that they are looking at that too, but I would say if we only look at our national parks, we're forgetting that nature needs to thrive everywhere, not just in nature reserves.
Absolutely. And something that I've been working on with the Sustainable Food Trust, and Daylesford's had its farm sort of measured and audited, is that balanced scorecard of all sustainability pillars. So not just drilling down in biodiversity terms, but what other, I don't want to jump ahead in the questions, but natural capital opportunities for natural flood management, for cleaning the water, cleaning the air, building community resilience and economy and healthier food and all of those other opportunities. Interestingly, though, biodiversity so often does fit with achieving all of those other natural capital objectives. We'll come on to that. So I think before we go on to the next section, who wants to tackle the question of what is the Sculptor review, which came out, what, a month ago? Was it 2 months ago? There's one person that's probably very qualified to answer that in Richard, but I'd welcome perhaps a comment from everyone on the Sculptor review. Richard, perhaps kick us off.
I'll kick us off, but others are much more qualified than I am, and we're pleased to be doing a green recovery project, which is being led by Green Alliance at the moment. So Shaun, no doubt, will have the best view on this. But the Sculptor review tried to do for biodiversity what the Stern review did for climate change, if you remember that, a decade or so ago, which is to look at the economic case for investing in tackling the biodiversity crisis. So it asked, in what way does our economy depend on the natural environment, and what would be the opportunity cost of investing to turn around the decline in the natural environment? And Professor Sculptor was quite bold in his conclusions. He said that the entire global economy is bounded by the limits of our biosphere. So in other words, there's no such thing as continuous growth. You're limited by your natural environment. He said that there are systemic failings in the way that we govern ourselves that mean that we don't invest enough in nature. So not just market failures, not just a failure to cost the environment, but a very failure in the way we set up our national and international institutions to realize that they are that nature is integral to all of our social and economic purposes. And he made some really strong conclusions for an economist around saying that, yes, there are economic answers to this question around investment and valuation and getting things like taxation right. But there are also regulatory options that need to be taken. So it was really good to see him recognizing that things like protected areas and just saying no sometimes is really important for protecting our natural world. So it was a huge and impressive report, and I hope that it will have the same sorts of global resonance in treasuries around the world that the Stern Review did in getting governments to be bold about the investments and the systemic change they need to finally look after nature.
Brilliant, Richard. Thank you for that. That's a great introduction to the next part. Would anybody like to add to that? And Shaun, Richard, of course, referred to the Green Alliance work. So perhaps could you mention that?
Well, look, I think it's potentially a great milestone. We don't know yet whether it's going to have the traction that the Stern report had. But when the Stern report was launched, it was Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, sort of with Lord Stern in the middle. When the Dasgupta report was launched, the Chancellor was nowhere to be seen. The Prime Minister did front the launch, and it is a very challenging report. In a way, it's a very technical report as well. There's two reports. There's a 100-page summary, and there's the 620-page report that Richard has read. And the summary starts with a sort of very powerful introduction from David Attenborough. We're facing a global crisis. We're totally dependent on the natural world. It supplies us with every oxygen-laden breath we take, and so on. And then you come to Professor Dasgupta's rather longer forward, where he says, the review is both long and technical. It is even mathematical. And then he says he was going to write a monograph, which is more readable, but I never expected the resulting monograph to be an easy read. It could not be, because the economics of diversity is a very hard subject. So it's hard work, and it's hard work in a way. Biodiversity is just intrinsically a harder subject, a more complex subject than climate change, and one that we have not been debating in political terms really for very long. So the real struggle is to translate for UK politics. The struggle is to translate a global report into specific UK policy actions, and to get that, as it were, into the political bloodstream. I'm quite hopeful about that. We had an all-party parliamentary group, the all-party parliamentary group on the environment, where Sajid Javid gave a great speech on it, Annalisa Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor. There were lots of MPs and peers from all parties, a lot of kind of energy and enthusiasm behind the report. But we do need to get the Treasury on side, and it's not 100% clear how committed they are.
Well, with that, I think I'm going to ask a couple of short fire questions, because I think we can start to address that. So, in a nutshell, and I mean like a one-sentence summary, public money for public goods. Richard, you probably were developing that with the agriculture bill and so on. So far away, in a one-line, public money for public goods. What does that mean?
It means that instead of paying subsidies for how much land you own in future, we are going to pay farmers for enhancing access to nature, beating climate change, reducing flood risk, enhancing biodiversity. And we just can't do this without farmers And this policy is really exciting because finally we're going to be able to recognise the farmers who do really great work for nature by paying them for the stewardship of the land that they do. I'm so really optimistic that this is going to make a massive change.
Another way of looking at it, Tim, is that essentially huge amounts of taxpayers' money over many decades has been given to landowners and farmers, and generally factoring out the effects on our natural environment. But the costs of that have been picked up by the taxpayer elsewhere in the system. So water pollution, for example, still has to be paid for, but it's not reflected in the price, so the incentives are all wrong, and we still end up paying the price. So this is about trying to close the loop on that. That's my rather simplistic take on it, but it's getting the public money that is spent to work better for us with fewer of the leakages, I suppose, which tend to be expressed in terms of things like soil degradation, pollution, air pollution, water pollution, you name it, which the taxpayer still ends up paying for one way or the other, even indirectly. You may not pay, you may not show it on your tax bill, but someone's paying for pollution to be cleaned up, or the health service is paying for unhealthy people taking up beds, to put it crudely. That's the way it works.
And it's a lot more expensive, isn't it, to deal with that end of it rather than just prevent it in the first place. So if we've got the investment up front for the, to prevent the water pollution in the first place, that's a better use of public money than to pay for it.
It's kind of taking the costs out, as many as you can, and it's a bit like following from the point Shaun was making about the Dasgupta review. That's not the first time we've done one of these big reviews about the economics of our natural environment. It's just the latest one in a way. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And the public goods for public money type debate, I think, is, I'm optimistic too, because I think it changes the nature of the debate so much. I would make the case, and I have made this point to government, I would make the case that instead of, and I know we're dealing with post-Brexit settlement, about £3 billion a year to farmers and landowners, I think if we think that the removal of those costs is something worth paying and using public money to do, then actually farmers and landowners should get more, not just the amount that we're taking out of the system from leaving the EU and the Common Agricultural Policy. Because if it's doing that job for us, then it's not just about replacing the current level of subsidy, it's starting to take out those costs which aren't factored in. Yeah. So I'd say double it.
Polluter pays as well as rewarding the rebuilding. I mean, polluter pays has been around for a while now, but it's reinforcing that whilst also investing in rebuilding and positive action towards the next point, ecosystem services. So I think we sort of touched on it, but we see that word bounded around, or natural capital. Shaun, could you say, should we be investing in ecosystem services? I mean, we've just said time and time again, yes, we should. Perhaps explain how we could do that. How can we invest in ecosystem services and natural capital?
Well, I think through the public money for public goods is clearly one way. I'm struggling to remember the figure that we've said. Richard, back to you, I'm afraid. I'm going to deflect this question to you. What's the figure we said needs to be invested in to restore the natural environment in England?
Well,
So Tim, whenever I ask Richard a question he can't answer, he gets
£100 million.
Try that again, Richard.
Did I freeze?
Yes.
We thought that
it's
you
that
got
old
stumped.
Trick. I think it was something like
I think it's such an enormous number.
£1 a year extra was, of course.
And so, Shaun, I was sort of alluding to what, so we've got the public spend to go into that, but there are also mechanisms of private investment, aren't there? And that links back to house building, perhaps.
Well, there's some two things worth saying on private. Well, lots of things, but one thing is one of the parts of the Environment Bill is to introduce biodiversity net gain. So if there are housing developments, then there must be a gain in biodiversity to compensate for the loss, the loss of land. That should also apply to public projects like, well, I'd like to see no new road schemes, but if there are road schemes, there should be biodiversity net gain, could be for HS2 and so on. I think one of the other things, though, which is quite interesting, is getting private investment into land management. So one of the projects the Green Alliance has worked on in the Eden Valley in Cumbria with the National Trust and Nestle and United Utilities is a group of farmers being paid by Nestle or United Utilities to manage their land differently, with less runoff, better soil management, less phosphorus in the water for the water company, a better long-term future for dairy farming, which is in Nestle's interest because they've got a dairy plant up there. And this leaves in private money for the public goods. But if you could then top that up with funding from the government, so if the farmers are sort of planting trees which are being paid for by the private companies because it benefits them, can you get an added benefit in terms of carbon storage or biodiversity or whatever? And I think there's an awful lot of money, public and private, that goes into land management, a lot of regulation of the water companies and so on, but it's all a bit disjointed. It doesn't add, it doesn't, it's less than some of its parts in a way. And that's one of the discussions we're having at the DEFRA at the moment about how we can kind of get more for our money, public and private.
Interesting. I tackling that in a local farm cluster here, that idea of layering investment and public funds to really start changing the equilibrium to favour regenerative agricultural practices. So yeah, I think it's a great opportunity.
It's quite Alison, exciting, and if we I'm sorry, Tim, I'd say it's quite exciting, and we've got there's got hundreds of schemes. If we have thousands of schemes, they really would complement each other, and we'd start getting the economies of scale.
Exactly. I think I'm positive we're at a tipping point, and I share that optimism, I think, with you guys as well. But Alison, we haven't touched on the controversial R word, and that's rewilding, although we did mention about the landscapes of Cumbria and the Cambrian Mountains and so on. But you could perhaps use your marine example of land sharing or land sparing. But you know, obviously as regenerative organic farmers at Daylesford, we believe in land sharing. But what's your interpretation of land sharing or land sparing, indeed marine sharing, marine sparing?
Well, I hope it's feasible as well. Certainly the project that we mentioned earlier on, that as I'll chair, we have the Essex Native Oyster Restoration Initiative. And this is a collaboration between NGOs such as ourselves and Essex Wildlife Trust, Blue Marine, government, Natural England Environment Agency, CFAS, but also industry as well. So the oystermen of Essex, notably the Blackwater. For a long time, they like to say they farmed oysters in the Blackwater estuaries, and these are Pacific oysters largely, but also they've championed the cause of native oysters. Native oysters have been removed from our waters by about 95%. We're down to the last 5% of our native oysters across the UK. But in this one area, the Blackwater estuary, Mersey, we have a stronghold of them. And as a consequence, and this is as a consequence of the oystermen bought back these lands from big business and have kept them in sort of quite small private grounds at the moment. So as a result, we've got like a holding stock, a breed stock of native oysters that then basically underpinned the designation of an area of marine conservation zone. And the conservation feature there is a native oysters and native oyster habitat. So at the moment, we're going through the process of how can we work together to restore native oysters across the whole of the marine conservation zone, so that we have a self-sustaining population that supports the biodiversity and all the different ecosystem services that we're talking about earlier on. So the water purification, taking the excess nutrients out of the water, that's carbon's question, if we leave it alone, maybe it'll sequester, but if we agitate it, maybe the carbon goes back out. But also the cultural provisioning of ecosystem services as well. So how do we balance that, but at the same time keep a sustainable livelihood in oysters as well? And we've done it through zoning effectively. We have a no-take zone, or a large no-take zone, that no dredging of oysters goes on, but also working with the IFCA for areas where there are oyster takes from the Marine Conservation Zone. Obviously that's a bit controversial as well. So that's where we are going with that. It's been a journey, but hopefully we'll get to the point where it's recognised that, the value of having to invest in it to get the ecosystem services back out. Because I think that within the tone of the voice of optimism for today, I think we are understanding that we can give nature time. If we give it space to recover, it can recover. And so it might not be back to where it was, 2000 years ago. We've got our shifting baselines that we mentioned earlier on as well. But we can get to a point of having healthy seas again. We've just got to give the seas space, and we have to probably invest for some active restoration as well.
I think bringing the key stakeholders on board, and the fishermen and so on, is so important. And the foundation, Daylesford Foundation, supported the National Lobster Hatchery down in Padstow, probably one of the most visited, tiniest of aquariums in the country. But it's punching well above its weight, and it sounds like we don't hear about those sorts of, your Oyster initiative or Lobster initiative that they're doing, buy one set one free initiative, I think it's called. We often hear about the sort of the big battles of rewilding versus farming arguments, but it's wonderful to hear those optimistic projects that are going on. Thank you. I think we should skip on because we have got a question burning in the chat box. So to bring us to a close, what can we do? And Alison, I'm going to go back to you. Is there enough, sorry, no, I'm going to ask Paul because you are the campaign man. Is there enough education and awareness on biodiversity collapse? You have headed up the B Cause for 8 years, as we said, or started 8 years ago, amongst other things. So is there enough education and awareness on biodiversity decline?
Is there enough education? Well, this could go in a number of directions. So there's quite a movement about saying that, the way we educate children needs to be improved in terms of the curriculum and things like that. I think it's an interesting debate because I certainly learned more about stuff after I left school than when I was in school about the realities of this. And I think it's about continuous learning and lifetime learning. I think right now people are waking up to this agenda. And as we said earlier, people realize it's not about climate over here and nature over here. They're kind of joined at the hip. And unless we work that through, we're going to be hobbling. I think that awareness doesn't necessarily lead to action. We've had decades of awareness. You referred to Sir David Attenborough. Sir David Attenborough has been on telly for decades. And there were programs that he wasn't even in, like Survival in the 1970s, that were telling us about this stuff. So the issue is, what do you do as a knowledgeable species, as a kind of, a clever species, when you realize that you're overreaching? And what does that mean for the institutions and the systems of governance and the way society organizes itself? And I think there's huge appetite, but I think people need to be empowered to work out what their role is. If they're concerned, that's great. I always believe in a little knowledge is a great thing as well, to turn that one on its head, because if you've got a little knowledge and a little bit of interest, you can learn very quickly. It doesn't mean you have to become a Chris Packham overnight, but your ability to then perhaps empower yourself to be an active citizen and not just a passive consumer increases immeasurably. And I think that's where we're going. And I think more people want that. And I think layers of society do that. I'm really tired of the town versus country debate, or those that do and those that don't. We need nature to thrive everywhere. We need people to be acting for nature everywhere. And that requires all layers of society. And I think you know, is there enough education? There's never enough education. The question is, how do you use it in the right way to reach the right people and to get them, you know, to a point where they want to do something about it, I suppose. And that's my job as a campaigner and a policy person to an extent. Yeah.
I was really encouraged that my 5-year-old daughter in reception in the local primary school came back with some habitats homework and 12 species to learn the difference between nocturnal and diurnal and so on. And one of them was corncrake, one of them was nightingale, nightjar, and kingfisher, as well as, you know, great tits, blue tits, and things. And I thought, well, good, you know, let's hope we can hold on to corncrakes long enough for them to think they won't be learning about the extinct species in the next.
Exactly.
10
I think
years.
it's worth also saying that the UK, you know, ZSL, you know, ZSL and other organisations, the Natural History Museum and the Linnaean Society, and all these organisations, we have got Kew Gardens, Royal Botanic Society, massive levels of knowledge. This, I know we're talking about British biodiversity here, but also Britain's influence around the world is huge, and we underplay that at our peril, I think. So, you know, we have the assets and the science and the knowledge to empower people in this country about their backyard nature, as well as what goes on beyond. And I think people are up for that. And there's no shortage of organisations that are members of Wildlife and Countryside Link and the Green Alliance who have got this information and can point it to people to it. It's what are the routes in, you know, how do we get the right routes in, I think. So yeah, there's no shortage of that stuff, but maybe the landscape is too confusing. Maybe people are confused by the array of signposts.
Tim,
Shaun, you were going to jump in, yeah.
Well, I was going to say that I think there's a challenge, obviously, about getting people to be aware of nature, and those who are involved in it with it kind of grieve about children who are sort of nature depleted, who don't get out in the countryside or into their local environments or whatever. That's a sort of social problem, and that's harming their lives. But politically, the real challenge we have is getting the concern for nature and the countryside to have a political bite. Because there are millions of people who watch Spring Watch, there are millions of people who love walking in the countryside, 5-6 million members of the National Trust, or whatever. Very seldom does this stuff win or lose an election. There's individual campaigns around housing. I'd say there's individual campaigns against wind farms in recent decades, where it's had political bite, but on the whole, it hasn't featured until quite recently. What we're now getting at last is a bit of a competition between the parties about which can be the greener, and it does appear to be having some bite, more on climate than on nature yet. But in a way, if we had the most knowledgeable and concerned electorate in the world, but they voted on other issues, that wouldn't shift the dial politically.
Interesting, yeah. We did have a good question from Leo Weston that's been burning in the chat box. To that end, you know, what can be done to get support of the media to try and change consumer expectation and ultimately influence those retailers in order to support ecologically sound farming practices to help repair biodiversity? I mean, you know, we could spend an hour talking about that, but I think you're right. You know, using politicians as an example there, you can have all of the Zach Goldsmith in cabinet, but unless you've got the will of the public and not too much on the agenda in other departments, it's not going to happen. Perhaps someone could, you know, answer that. You know, what can we all do in our everyday lives to make a difference? Alison, you see lots and lots of people come through ZSL, everyday people just wanting to connect with nature. You know, what do you think we can do?
I think, I mean, this my personal thing is, I feel like we've all got, we're probably talking to a very educated audience here or discussing, but sort of unconscious bias in our decision making, and we start learning and talking a lot about this, about, you know, diversity, inclusion. But I think it's the same as for the environment as well. I mean, how many people sit awkwardly at a restaurant table or a cafe and say, "Can I have a glass of tap water, please?" rather than, "Can I have a bottle of minerals or plastic water?" because they think, A, it might, might look better, but B is sort of, because it's in a bottle, it's better for us. So that understanding, I think we've got to get over and acknowledge to ourselves that nature is actually good and it's fine and it's the best probably that we can have. And so nature is biodiversity, and it's all linked together. So if we start acknowledging what some of these unconscious biases are, and that nature has an equal value and is fundamental, then perhaps we can start making decisions that are truer to ourselves and truer to the earth.
Absolutely interesting. And Richard, what do you think could have the biggest impact in turning the needle? We've heard from Shaun on that, really, but what do you think? Anything to add?
Well, I think the political question is the big one. So we've talked about how this is an optimistic day, and I don't want to put a downer on it, but the optimism is all unproven at the moment. So we're talking now about changes like public money for public goods, and we're talking about big global deals for nature, but those words have all come before. And meanwhile, nature continues in decline. And it's worth saying it as often as we possibly can at the moment. We're in the grip of a global pandemic caused by our abusive relationship with nature. And that's just one of the worries waiting down the wings if we don't take really serious, radical change to turn around the way we treat our natural environment. So what can we do? Well, we need to make it a big political issue. And at risk of sort of stealing Paul's show as the campaigner of the day, there's a petition you can sign right now on the Wildlife and Countryside Link website to ask Boris Johnson to put in law in the UK the promises he's making on the global stage. So leaders all around the world are talking about setting targets to restore nature by 2030. And we've got an environment bill going through Parliament right here at the moment where we could put that in the domestic law, and that would follow through to everything. It would answer Leo's question about, it would answer by driving prices towards the most green products. It would drive investment that we were talking about earlier. It would drive political action. So let's get that target to hold politicians to account, our net zero for nature in law. And if you can do one thing today, please sign our petition to ask Boris Johnson to put a 2030 commitment to halt the decline of nature in England in law. Then, of course, you can stop mowing your lawn, stop putting pesticides on things, stop using plastic bottles and all those other wonderful things. But if we can get that political change in there first, it will help us to make the right choices, because it will change the system and drive that political action and investment. And Shaun has put the link helpfully in the chat, so please sign and share, because it could make a huge difference.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. So are there, just as we draw to a close, and we welcome questions in the chat forum from our audience. Unfortunately, we can't really bring people in to ask formally, but to sort of close what we can do, are there any brands that you admire for what they're doing, what action they're doing, or businesses where you'd recommend to follow, that are leading the charge on this?
Daylesford.
Oh, come on, that's shame. Your hamper is on its way. No, I mean, I'm going to say, I think Guy Watson at Riverford is absolutely amazing at saying it as it is, and some brands really embrace what needs to be said. Others try and sort of hang on to the coattails of others. But we're doing all sorts of other things as well. But yeah, have you got any interesting brands?
Just one brand worth highlighting is, and I haven't done a proper analysis of how well they sort of walk the walk as well as talk the talk, but I think Iceland is very interesting, because it's kind of, Daylesford, Riverford, Waitrose are serving better off people who can afford, as it were, the luxury of paying extra. Iceland is not in that market, and yet it really is trying to do some quite interesting things. I'm not saying across the board, but they are serious, for instance, about plastic pollution and so on. So I would highlight Iceland, I think.
Yeah. Palm oil as well, wasn't it? Was it palm oil?
Palm oil too, yeah. Engaging seriously with the issues.
I've got a
Tim,
question.
sorry, Tim, I think there's some really good examples of individual companies potentially doing things. It's a question of that becoming mainstream. I see a lot of organisations starting to almost use the language of protecting nature and whatever, but actually they're not fundamentally changing their business model and their practices, or if they are, it's very, very slow. They'll do it eventually. Well, we don't have time. We actually need to get on a pathway this decade that starts to turn around things both for climate reasons and for nature reasons. So I think it's very hard to put my hand on my heart and say, you know, that big corporation there or whatever is doing a really good job. I think there are signs of companies who are starting to factor this in, but they haven't got there yet. They're behind the curve. They need to get on the curve very quickly, because I think the public appetite is there for it, and there's market leadership to be seen. But yeah, if Daylesford and Guy Watson and Iceland could get together and scale it all up, then fine, I could sit back and relax.
Any other comments before I ask a question from Rhea Jordan? Okay, I'll go ahead. So by March the 17th, we're being asked to comment on the regulation of genetic technologies. What are the panel's thoughts about this?
This is a question about, this is a gene editing consultation that's out, isn't it? It's not.
So it's very relevant to biodiversity in many respects.
Strictly, it's not the same as genetic modification. It's a different technique, and there was, if you want to catch up on it, and I thought it was pretty good and fairly balanced. Farming Today last week ran a whole week of programs on it, so it's worth listening to that. Friends of the Earth is as responsible as ever and being sufficiently sceptical about the need and the motivations behind it, and our response will go in fairly soon. Some of these things could be a diversion from what's actually needed to address some of the basic things that we just need to do for nature. So there is a danger that all these things come along as bright, shiny new sweets in the sweetie shop for us to grab on as though it's going to solve all our problems. These promises are made all the time, and actually some of the basic things we just need to do well and all the time are the things we keep failing to do. You know, so protecting soils, restoring rivers, bringing back species, avoiding undue or even any use of chemicals, fertilizers and things like that. And that's getting us off the treadmill, you know. And then we can look at, just to be clear, Friends of the Earth is not against the principle, the idea of any of this stuff, but the way it's very often used is over-promising and under-delivering.
That's a really interesting point, Paul. A fellow board member of agroecology, Alistair Leake from Alison Project, very, very clever soil and regenerative agriculture academic. He pointed out that there's not an issue with a seed of wheat, new wheat breed that can deal with compaction in a field to be able to push its roots down and so on and so forth through a bit of genetic editing. The issue is why the compaction's there in the first place and what it's doing to the rest of the soil that results in you needing to edit that seed to be able to cope with it. And so, yeah, going back to factoring in the other ecosystem services, whether that's carbon emissions or natural flood management and all those sorts of things, you know, it needs to be put into the context of that. I completely agree with you, Paul. Yes. I can't keep up with the questions here. Would anybody else care to comment while I'm too enthralled in the
I've just commented on Lyndon's question, which is Shaun and Richard's territory, really. But my response is slightly cheeky. You know, shouldn't all the NGOs get together? I think it's fair to say that we do that probably more than people realise. We all come at this slightly differently, you know, but the amount of cooperation and unity and discussion, I mean, I spend half my life in meetings with Richard, you know, or his team, and it's, you know, we're testing each other, we're pushing each other, but we're coming up with common approaches. And the stuff Richard talked about, the campaign that Wildlife Countryside Link has gathered various organisations around is just one example of that. And Green Alliance does this stuff all the time across a whole, arguably a broader sector. And maybe we should just be better at communicating the fact that there's more cooperation and unity than, and there is competition to a certain extent, but there's probably more unity and cooperation than people imagine.
If I just add to that, I think the very fact we've got an environment bill is down to joint NGO campaigning. We were the only sector that got an amendment, successfully got an amendment to the EU Withdrawal Act. It's a hell of a long time coming, and it's been delayed again. But we have got a very ambitious, not quite ambitious enough, an ambitious environment bill in the pipeline. And Green Alliance has coordinated the Green UK coalition on that. Wildlife and Countryside Link how many members have you got, Richard? 60, 70?
Just 57, I think.
Well, whatever. And that working really closely with Wildlife and Countryside Link on that, particularly the targets aspect. So no doubt we could do more, but I think there is a lot of cooperation across all groups.
Yeah, we're part of the APPG on agroecology, and yeah, getting agroecology in the agriculture bill was like a real sort of win. And there were a lot of organisations collaborating through Sustain and various others to achieve that. So yeah, there are examples, but of course, individual organisations need to raise their membership funds and so on. So often the customer only sees, or the citizens only see the brands of those organisations, as opposed to the collaborative effort in the background. But I applaud both Richard and you, Shaun, for bringing people together in that front. And Paul, of course, the big campaign for B Corps was a huge number of different organisations, including some of the big polluters as well. So it's a really interesting example, because although it was Frenzy Earth's campaign, we went out of our way to make sure that we created space for lots of other organisations to come in on it as well and find their way. And we had a lot of contact with farmers who wanted to go on a journey that I think many, since that campaign started, which is 7 or 8 years ago, there's some really interesting innovation going on by farmers and landowners who want to start doing the right thing and don't necessarily buy some of the kind of traditional lines that are given by some of the sector's representatives. So, but we were very open with that. We were talking to the NFU, we were talking to the pesticides industries, we invited them to our events and things like that. And so, again, I think that's an example of kind of open campaigning and open cooperation with people. Excellent. Well, we have come to the end of a wonderful discussion. I think we could carry on forever. I'm going to have to draw this to a close, but before we do, one tip to answer Hannah's question. Paul, you can say it out loud. You've already answered it. What do you feel are the best things we can do at an individual level from our own homes and gardens and purchasing? So a really short answer, because we are running over time. Alison, far away.
I think try to drill down, if you're on your purchasing, sort of the origin of what you're buying. Or first of all, question, do you actually really need it? And then consider where you're going to get it from. And as best you can from the available information, see whether it's an ethical source. Very quick.
Brilliant. Thank you. Paul, you've answered.
I answered, don't buy peat, support truly peat-free. This is going places, so get behind genuine peat-free. Drop the pesticides, you really don't need them. You're pouring money down the drain, and have a diversity of plants all year round, including places for shelter for different bugs and species to overwinter. Brilliant.
Shaun?
Well, I agree with Alison and Paul, and I will agree with Richard. All those things. But I would also say that individual action alone will not be enough in terms of purchasing, green consumerism and so on. So this does need to have, politicians need to feel a bit of pain on this and a bit of passion.
Brilliant. Okay, keep the lobbying up. And then to conclude then, Richard.
Don't mow the lawn.
Lovely.
They're obviously all very good ones, and particularly where you're getting your products from, and actually checking that things are sustainably sourced is just got to be top of the list.
Wonderful, wonderful. Panelists, thank you so much for coming on this evening. It's been wonderful to chair you. I'm sorry I haven't managed to ask all the questions, I probably brought us back to the questions that I premeditated too much. I should have let us run, but it's been a wonderful evening. And so, from the chickens in my very fake background of the Daylesford agroecology, our little token to biodiversity, and from me and my children downstairs screaming, thank you very much, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye for now.
Good evening. Bye.